Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series. My name's Stuart Clark. I'm a rep within the Flight Safety Department at BALPA, the British Airline Pilots Association. As many of you will know, BALPA and GATCO, the Guild of Air Traffic Control Officers, have fostered a very close working relationship over many years. We collaborate and support each other with regular joint meetings through the creation of policy documents and position papers, with presentation of evidence to House of Commons select committees, meetings with DFT and CAA, as well as linking up through our international connections in IFALPA, IFATCA, and the European Cockpit Association. Over the last few years, we've hosted symposium events with a wide range of speakers covering many and varied subjects: airspace modernisation, single European skies, just culture, fatigue, drones and counter-UAS technology, meteorology, electronic conspicuity, and a number of others. As with last year, COVID has precluded a physical symposium, so we've decided to continue with our series of webinars. This year, there'll be 4 90-minute sessions on the first 4 Mondays in November, each focusing on a subject which is relevant to our 2 communities. Before we commence, I'd like to offer my thanks to the outgoing president of GATCO, Luis Barbero, who's been the driving force behind our joint symposiums and webinars. Many thanks to Luis for his tireless work in support of GATCO and collaboration with BALPA. I'd also like to say a sincere thank you to Phil Tanner for his organising of this year's events. Phil's put in an immense amount of work to deliver the 2023 programme of webinars. During the presentations, we'll be collating your questions and putting them to the presenters at the end of the session. If possible, please use the Q&A function of the webinar software to post any questions to the panellists. Where similar questions come in, we'll endeavour to combine them into a single question, so apologies in advance if your exact question doesn't appear to have been asked. We'll do our best to capture the essence of all the questions. There's also a text chat function for general discussions or if you need to send technical messages to the webinar organisers. A few basic rules, hopefully to make the event run as smoothly as possible. Would everyone put themselves on mute and switch off their videos? So just the presenter and hosts will be on the screen. Switching off video will also help prevent any problems with bandwidth on your internet connection, so the presentation should run more smoothly. Please also be aware that the event is being recorded for future distribution. So without more ado, I'll hand over to BALPA's Head of Flight Safety, Joji Waits, who will introduce our guests and will be acting as the moderator for this session. Joji, over to you.
Thank you, Stu, for setting the scene and for your introduction. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all our attendees today. We're truly grateful for you taking the time to join us and look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions through the session. Of course, the outlook today for our industry is much brighter compared to when we last hosted this symposium. It still feels incredible that we have yet to fully escape the grip of the pandemic. However, it does allow us to run these events and facilitate the involvement of some first-class guests. I'm therefore delighted to introduce from the UK Civil Aviation Authority, Glenn Bradley, who's the Head of Flight Operations, and Catherine Jones, who is the Human Factors Programme Lead. I'm equally delighted to introduce Steve Ford, the Director of Aviation at Chirp. Thank you for you all to spare the time in your busy schedules to support this session today. We're really, truly grateful for you. The theme of today's session is very much about reflecting on the lessons learned during the pandemic, both from an operational perspective and discussing how these learnings can be applied to ensure we are best placed to deal with whatever challenges the future might bring. This is particularly pertinent now that the recovery is gaining momentum and there has been time for us to have observed and understood the consequences of the pandemic. So we will start with the panellists introducing themselves more fully and offering the insights on what they each feel to be the 3 key learning points for them in the past year or so. We'll then cover some questions that have been submitted ahead of this symposium before taking live questions from the audience. The questions will be grouped into 3 sections: consequences of the pandemic, recovery from the pandemic, and future challenges and opportunities. Just to reiterate what Stu says, if you could please use the dedicated Q&A function for your questions. It's so much easier for us to keep track of them when they're separated from the general comments that you may make during the session on the chat function. So really appreciate your understanding there. So let's get started. If I could please ask Glenn to kick us off, followed by Catherine and Steve. Over to you, Glenn.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joji. And thank you to both BALPA and GATCO for inviting us for this opportunity to be able to talk to everybody. It's really appreciated. It's a very useful forum to be able to do that. So as Joji says, I'm Glenn Bradley, Head of Flight Operations at the CAA, and I've been here about 4 years, having spent about 20 or so odd years in industry and a career in the Air Force before that as well. So it's a great position to be in, and I hope I can provide some value in that. So the textbook question that Joji posed for us, what are the 3 learning points you've had over the pandemic? And for me, they fall into three different areas. The first one is, if we look at ourselves as an industry, historically we've relied on a degree of certainty and predictability. So if you look at safety management systems, they look at what has happened, kind of look backwards, look at the data, look at and predict the way things are going to be moving forwards, and recommend action and mitigations based on that, which is all quite sensible. There's very clever ways of doing that. You can dig down into more granularity and look at precursors and even precursors to precursors and come up with some very clever systems. That all relies on a degree of predictability. What the pandemic has taught us is that's kind of gone out of the window, and we're all facing into uncertain situation from both a financial perspective, especially, but also from an operational perspective. The world changed overnight. The skies became much emptier, and the operating environment not only changed very quickly, last March, but it also has been changing ever since as well. And we are, as an industry, we are not used to working in a changing environment. So if you look back at 2020, obviously, March, everything fell off a cliff. There was a slow kind of build up over the year towards Christmas, but nothing like was expected. And 2021 was expected to be a much larger ramp up. The industry would, set about putting various pieces in place. We did a lot of work behind the scenes to understand what risks we thought were going to come about by a rapid ramp up, which is, was actually the kind of the best case scenario for the industry, but a kind of the worst case scenario from a safety and a predictability point of view, and did a lot of work with industry about that. So what we actually saw was 2021 has been much slower and a smaller build up than anticipated. So we've gone from roughly 30% of 2019 traffic figures up to about around 60 odd percent of where we are, which is just less than hoped. And we got to a kind of critical point probably around end of July or August, where that was it. The industry was not going to be able to put any more capacity into the market. The world was not going to suddenly open up. If suddenly the world had opened up, there wasn't the ability to ramp up any quicker from that. So that was as uncomfortable, but actually from a risk perspective, gave us a degree of comfort because we knew where we were. If anything was going to happen, capacity was going to come out of the market, and that takes risk away. So our concerns around risk were at the initial part, the very beginning, the very quick rundown of the industry, what that meant, what decisions were being made to protect companies financially, and what knock-on effect that would have to an operational perspective. For 2021, we did a lot of work about where we thought the risks were going to be, worked with industry, and the ramp up has been slower and more controlled and comfortable with that. We have seen some of the issues that we flagged up appear, but nowhere near as many or as serious as we had potentially feared. Now, is that because we did lots of work, an industry did lots of work in that space, or is it because the ramp up was more controlled? We'll probably never know the answer to that, but I think there's a lot we can do from lessons learned from that. And I think we're now looking at a situation where we're facing into what potentially, hopefully, is going to be a busy 2022. That the thing about the certainty and predictability was that it was not being driven by COVID itself. It was being driven by the aviation restrictions through governments around the world, through countries being closed off, through markets being closed, to what individual states were doing, what requirements they had, and hence consumer confidence in bookings and things like that. So when we talk about last summer, the government were in a kind of a 3-week cycle about updating the system, and the industry got into the same cadence as well. So they knew that the announcements come on Thursday. It was going to to be enacted on the Monday morning at 4 o'clock. So everybody got into a kind of rhythm that gave us a kind of a small degree of predictability, which was good. It was not great for the industry, but it was good because at least everybody knew what the cadence was. And there was an event that happened outside of that that did kind of upset the apple cart a bit around Jamaica being pulled at short notice. So even that short-term certainty and predictability really kind of helps the industry. I think the difference now is that we're facing into is the red list is effectively gone. The traffic light system is gone. The US market will open up to vaccinated people. So we're heading towards a scenario where there's a degree of predictability, presuming nothing changes at the moment. There's a degree of predictability as we go into to 2022, and it will be driven by airline ambition and desire, and how big the schedules they want to build to ramp up. The concern there, of course, is we're going from whereas 2021 we went from like 30% to 60%, we're now going from like 60 probably to up to between 80 and 100% of 2019 figures, and that creates an issue because whilst it sounds like it's only 10% more, when you're operating at 6%, there's a lot more capacity and resilience in the system than if you're operating up near 80, 90, and 100%. And a lot of that concern we have around that is around the supply chain. So it's not just crews, cabin crews, it's refuelers, air traffickers, caterers, you name it. There's the world has changed on the outside, such there's a lot of people have moved out of the industry and won't be rushing to come back into an unpredictable industry when there's better things to be doing on the outside and probably make them more money. So that certainly was the kind of first bit. The second bit was kind of overlaid on the top of that. For us, risk is brought about by change fundamentally. A good safety management system will have a good management of change process in it. But where there's drivers outside that, such as the very quick ramp down of the initial part of the pandemic, that creates risk. Changes that lack control create risk. So as I said last summer, we got into a cadence, so there was a predictability pace that created a change process that was manageable. And of course, moving into 2022, yes, there's going to be lots of change, but a lot of that will be in the control of the operators. Some of it won't be, and especially around the supply chain. So it's it's managing the change, and the difference now is that the change is in the hands of the operators and the industry rather than in the hands of governments and states around the world. So that has shifted slightly. So excuse me. And the final point I wanted to make was about the ways to regulate. So obviously, when we were all locked down, we couldn't do any on-site oversight, so it was all done remotely. Although there was much less of an industry to actually oversee at that point. And of course, the restrictions limited what we could and couldn't do. That has changed over the last year or so, and we've been able to do more and more. But there's also a lot of good things to take from, and we have to look back at what we can take from the last 18 months and learn from it. So whilst it seems kind of sensible to think, well, we'll all just go back out and do on-site auditing as we did before. There's more to what we do as a regulator than just auditing. There's a lot of interaction with industry, safety meetings and bits and pieces, most of which is still being done virtually. So we can be more efficient and more effective by doing a combination of on-site and off-site oversight. And I think the important thing there is, as a regulator that has embedded procedures about performance-based regulation and performance-based oversight, we can then flex much more agilely to the needs that we see from a performance-based point of view. So if it's a case of, well, if it's a high-performing organization, why go and do an on-site compliance audit? If there's safety concerns, well, why are we doing a compliance audit when we should be attending safety meetings? And we have a lot more flexibility around that. So that really helps us. One of the things we did at the very beginning of the pandemic was, whilst we couldn't visit organizations, was to kind of change the plan, not necessarily throw the whole plan out the window, but obviously the on-site auditing. But the message to the team was get close to your organizations and understand what they're thinking and what they are planning, because that's where the risk is. The risk is in the change. So understand what they're doing, what their plans are, And that involved talking to some organisations, weekly, sometimes even daily, something we wouldn't necessarily do. And that's been very beneficial. The industry didn't know, they was facing into an uncertain situation, and as were we. And so I think that we've learned a lot from that, how we understand how organisations work, and we want to keep doing that. Obviously, there's still some things that we need to do on site, but that entity relationship. The problem that gives for us is that if we get too close, there's a risk of regulatory capture where we become too close to organisations. So there is that fine line that we have to balance. But the important point of that is that the closer we are to organisations, the better we understand how they work and how they're performing, the better we can apply performance-based oversight and regulation to them. So the three things in summary there is that the uncertainty and unpredictability that the situation gave us, and how we make the best use of that to make, from this point forwards, as safe as we possibly can. Understanding the change process and that change equates to risk. And then, for ourselves, understand how to regulate more effectively through this scenario and into the future. But that was it for me, Joji. Hope that was okay.
Really interesting, Glenn. That's three very distinct but pertinent issues there. And I think what you're saying in your third point probably links very nicely into the future as the industry starts to recover and builds up its operation, kind of knowing how the CA is going to regulate them, and is so key. So thank you. If I could hand over now to Catherine, please. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, Joji, and good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here today and to talk about the lessons learned from the pandemic, because I must say, I think that people have been amazing. We have been our best in a lot of the situations. We've been adaptable, flexible, problem solvers. So we've actually identified that we've worked with our best of our principles. And I think that is one of the things that I will take away, because we need to be more systemic. So I'm very privileged by being the lead for our human factors program across the Civil Aviation Authority. So I can see everything from how we put human factors into legislation, how we put it into space now, innovation technology, and also how we manage it across the fields of airspace, aerodromes, flight operations, and airworthiness. So I'm very fortunate to be able to look and to link across all of those different areas. And I do that internally and externally as the program lead. So throughout COVID, I've been very fortunate to be able to do all of that. And my key learning areas are very much about, we need to think more systemically about the human factor consideration. And I'm sure that I know BALPA have done a number of webinars around this subject, but as a global industry, those questions are being asked more. How are we doing this? Systems thinking, human-centered design, how can we better think about that? Because throughout the pandemic, one of the things is it can be too focused on the individual action or the individual error. And if we then take it into the more systemic issues and those supporting activities, so we should be looking more at capturing things and supporting people before we then get to talking about the individual error. So that's one of my key things around, we need to be more systemic. And I think the pandemic has shown that, because certain parts of our industry have been incredibly busy. And if you're an air traffic controller at East Midlands, you've been very busy, because that's our cargo hub, the same as if you've been a pilot for DHL. And that flexibility and change that Glenn was talking about, we've had traditional charter operators flying cargo flights. We've changed and adapted all of that across. So we need to think when we make those changes in much more of a systemic issue. And we also need to think not just internally within aviation of the system, but we need to think about the government influences, the states, the public, all of those aspects in terms of how we can best support the people in the industry that we're working in to do their best. And when we talk, so my second point is about that, supporting people individually. And it's been absolutely key. And there's been a lot about well-being. EASA has done a lot of work about that. We've published safety notices. There's been a lot in the press. about supporting people individually. But there's also been that slightly mixed message of delivering. So we have had that pressure. We've all felt it. We support you individually. And as an individual, we don't know whether you've been suffering from COVID, had family issues around that, friends, all of those other aspects that you will face individually. So we've been talking about well-being and how to support that, which has been fundamental as we went through the pandemic, especially to start off with that level of uncertainty for us as individuals. But we've also been focused on delivering collectively. So if your organization in one breath is saying, we want to give you space, we want to give you time, we want to support you as an individual, but in order to survive, can we have volunteers? Can we make sure that we meet this contract? We're going to change your roster or your shift pattern at short notice. So it is that sort of mixed message of we support you as an individual, but we're also then asking you to go above and beyond for the benefit of the collective. So that's been quite an interesting learning. And I think we need to unpick that a bit as we go forward from the lessons learned across all the different aspects, not just within the pilot and air traffic communities. So again, that's something that I've seen, not just in the UK, but I've been very privileged to see how that impact has been across the industry more globally. And then we've also led to that thinking about the individual and their actions. So we've had the risk of people feeling survivor guilt. So they've maintained their job or their role, and they've had friends and colleagues who haven't. So they're feeling grateful, but they're also feeling a bit of guilt because their colleagues haven't got that opportunity. And that can make us deliver keep the show on the road type of attitude. It can make us, when we're assessing those risks and making trade-offs on the day, we think very much more about, we need to keep the show going, the organization needs to function, we need to get money in if we're going to survive. So that can give both that challenge for us as individuals around, do we report things? And I know that's a theme. So initially, I think with the pandemic, when it hit, we did notice a drop-off of reporting. We did feel that people may have been holding back on that if they were still operating. And I think that has changed now. I think we're getting much more reports. I think people are feeling much more confident with actually being supported by their organizations and the industry to report. However, from a lessons learned point of view, noticing that shift, we need to do more to be proactive in how we actually understand the workers done world. What are the impacts to the changes of the airports, to shutting things down, to wearing masks, to having the social distancing, to doing video handovers if you're an airworthiness engineer on shift? What have those impacts been across the industry? So I think we need to be more creative with finding that. Lessons learned, what's going on in your world, your workers done world, than the one we're imagining, and not just wait for reports to tell us, but actually get more proactive in that. And technology has significantly helped us with the way that we can interact, the way that we can get information, the confidentiality of that information. So I think there's opportunities actually now to move from not just the traditional reporting ways, but to be that more proactive, to get information, to find information from people, and to use our networks more proactively. So I think those are my three things: that we need to be more systemic with how we look at our HF challenges, not just within the industry, but actually across the societal impacts, and try and anticipate what that's going to mean. We need to be able to support people individually, absolutely, but be mindful of that collective pressure that we put on people. And we need to recognize that we ask people to report, but they can be feeling in a very sensitive position with that. So we need to be more proactive about how we understand their workers done world in order that we can help them to do their best. So that's my 3 points.
Thank you, Catherine. Again, some really interesting points and very much resonating, I think, certainly with myself and with our membership, the bits about survivor's guilt. We've seen that throughout the pandemic, both from an industrial perspective, but also as you were saying, in terms of the sort of comfortability and ability to report stuff. I think the need for system thinking is very well made, and hopefully we can get a bit more into that in this session. But particularly the reporting aspects as well, how you've seen initial drop-off and then things have started to recover, is interesting. And I think it hopefully will lead in quite nicely to Steve's piece coming next. So thank you, Catherine. If I'll hand over to Steve now.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Joji, for that. My name's Steve Ford. I'm Director of Chirp Aviation. For those of you who haven't come across Chirp, and I hope most of you have, then we are the confidential human factors instant reporting program. And we act in parallel with the MOR, formal reporting process. But we act as a sort of safety net, really, if you like. So for those who don't feel they can report through normal processes, and they can come to Chirp totally confidentially, and we will report for them. And so we provide that so safety net, but also a view on reporting issues that may not otherwise have been raised. So I'm approaching this from a different perspective to Glenn and Catherine, who are looking, I would say, a top-down perspective from what they're seeing from the system. And of course, what I get is a bottom-up perspective from individuals who are commenting on what they see. So I hesitate to offer lessons. I offer perspectives, really, of what I'm seeing, and it's totally based on that. And I'm sort of reminded of that amusing anecdote of, when you're at the top of the tree, what you see when you look down are a bunch of monkeys. When at the bottom of the tree, what you see when you look up are a bunch of arseholes. So I've got to be very careful what I bring to this, because what I bring can be very much tainted by the perspective of looking up towards the top of the tree. I think Glenn was absolutely right in this whole thing. It's been, when I look at it as really a massive change process, COVID. We've gone from being a very stable industry to one full of turbulence. And it's how we've managed that change. That's where I've seen from my reporting that we can maybe learn more on how we have adapted to the new aviation world. I'm not going to say new normal. I don't think it is normal yet. The new aviation world, and it's really that change management. And to me, a lot of that is based on, for those of you who've ever read James Reason's pieces, the safety space between financially maintaining a viable company and maintaining a safe operation. And let's not be in two minds about this. This has been existential for companies in trying to maintain their business model and processes. And so they've had to do some pretty drastic things. And I think that's an important background which we need to remember, and is often forgotten in that we know, or I do get reports which can be based on so-and-so regulation says this, why aren't we doing that? Well, we're not doing that because we're in a different world now and things have to change a little bit. So that's the background perspective. And I look at this in change management in three elements that I've been seeing in my reporting to me. First one is how we've done change management and brought on the workforce with us. A lot of things have been done, as I mentioned, which have been pretty drastic stuff. They've had to be done. Flying rosters, schedules, reducing to next to nothing has forced change. But I don't think that universally those changes have been that well communicated to the workforce, or if they've been communicated, they haven't been received by the workforce particularly well, for whatever reason. And that's caused stress within the workforce and dare I say, a erosion of trust in the company, in the line management, because the workforce perceives that the company is not looking after their best interests. They're solely looking after the interests of the company. And that's put a different perspective on safety reporting, because people they're at risk of a culture of fear developing because they don't trust the system anymore. They don't want to report. I get a lot of reports in from people saying, I'm telling you this because I daren't raise my head above the parapet. That's a very unhealthy place to be as an industry. And so one of the biggest takeaways, probably number one takeaway for me, is we've got to rebuild that trust in reporting, not just the MOR reporting, the stuff which you have to report. And I think it was a phrase which Glenn used in another meeting, the continuum of reporting, where ranging from the right and left of things you have to report to those things which you notice didn't go quite so well during a flight or whatever, a sector, which, by reporting that to the system gives a fidelity of not just risk management, but safety management that companies need. So we need to rebuild that, I think, and there's a loss of that trust. So to me, that's one of the key perspective that I would bring as number one. Within that trust, there's been a perception of overt pressure to achieve performance indicators, getting off the stand on time or whatever, despite the additional changes, the processes and procedures that have been brought in, the perception that isn't taken into account by the company systems, but also there's a perception that people don't understand the procedures, and new procedures haven't been able to properly take them on board. The communication piece has been, in some respects, too little, but in a lot of respects, too much information overload. And so there's people trying to absorb changes very rapidly and not being able to do that, or fearful that they haven't quite understood that. So change management and engagement in the workforce. And that's really meaningful engagement, whereby employee and management fora, whatever they might be, are actively set up and seen to be valuable sources of feedback from the workforce. So that's number one. The second one is what I would call resources to task. I'm an ex-military aviator, by the way, so apologies for the military speak. As we ramp up aviation again, with many people who have been made redundant, on furlough, returning to the aviation environment, rusty, lack of currency or whatever, then we've got to be careful that we match the task level which we put on those people to their resource and capability. And I've had many reports from air traffic controllers and flight crew and cabin crew, not so much engineering, but I think there's an issue in engineering as well, where those who are remaining, not just the guilt piece, which we just spoke about with Catherine, but they are being asked to do things which are maybe slightly outside their scope, or they're taking on other people's work because those people are on furlough or plainly have been sacked, made redundant. And so there's pressure on the workforce to do more, to do things which they're not used to and not maybe fully up to speed with. And they will be qualified to do something, but that isn't the same as being competent. You may have been qualified to do whatever task many years ago, but you haven't done it for many months or I don't know, years, and so you're not really competent to do that task. So what? Well, that means that those of us who are in the working environment and in receipt of that, so those products, need to be really careful that we will give those who are doing extra a bit of flexibility and understanding, but also you need to be careful that they may well be doing tasks that they're not familiar with, and there will be errors within those tasks. So error trapping, as part of that change management piece, is something that the workforce needs to be very well aware of, and checking NOTAMs, tech log entries, whatever, for mistakes that may well be present because people are working very, very hard. And so we need to be aware of that as my sort of second point. And then my third point, I think, is what I'll call mental health and well-being. It's something which is very hard to quantify and to understand in the reporting process. But there's no doubt, and we all understand, I think, that there's a hell of a lot of stress out there, personal stress, from people who've been caught up in this whole process. And those personal stresses then have a distraction, element of distraction in people's work practices. I've had reports where people have been, their mind's not on the job, and they're not mentally prepared for what they're about to do. And so we need to understand those mental stresses as well. We're all people who make errors and mistakes. We're very poorly adapted to our environment in aviation. And so if your mind isn't on the job, then there's a risk of errors of mistakes being made. Now, some of that needs to be factored into the company schedules and rostering and processes. Some of it needs to be understood by those in the workforce. Your threat and error management needs to take into account, is everybody in the right mental space for this flight today, before we get airborne? Physically address that issue. Is everybody in the right space? Because I think it's very easy to miss that. I think Catherine touched on that. Making sure that the workforce is properly fit and able to do the role which they're about to do. So I think that's the third part of this change management thing for me, is understanding what stresses the workforce are under, and dare I say what stresses the management are under as well, don't forget, to make sure that we work, actually to use Catherine's number one issue, in a systemic manner to understand the risks involved. So I think those are my three key elements, Joji. Hopefully they made a bit of sense. First one being relationships with the workforce, to make sure change is managed properly. Second one is making sure the resources to task are matched. And the third one is to understand the stresses and strains at a human level in the workforce.
Many thanks, Steve. Yeah, that made perfect sense, and all the more powerful in that it's sort of distilled from reports you've received from actual people during this time. So these are individuals that are going through this process and feeling these things. So very, very interesting that, again, you cover things at a systemic level, very high level systemic type issues, but also issues down at the individual person level as well. And I think we can start to draw out some more of those issues with our questions later in the session. So thank you to you all for those really interesting insights. I mean, to me, there seems to be a common theme of change and the uncertainties associated with change. So whether that's change roles, a new operational environment, perhaps a different relationship between the regulator and operator service provider, or between the operator and the employee, all of which shines a light, as Steve has already alluded to, on the importance of effective change management. So perhaps to get the Q&A started now, could I take the liberty of asking a follow-on question to you all? What are your thoughts on how the management of change could be more effective? For example, in terms of the type of thinking used. Catherine already alluded to the importance of system thinking, the type of data, intelligence collected, etc. So if I could direct that question to the three of you, but again, following the same order, Glenn, followed by Catherine and Steve. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Judy. So change management, I think this comes back to one of my earlier points about certainty. So historically, change management has tended to be relatively small items, and changes in processes and procedures, less so about much larger changes. So I think there needs to be a much greater system thinking. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So if your business model has been flying long haul for a long period of time, and you hit a pandemic, and it's like, now we need to change our business model into flying cargo or mix of cargo and passengers, that's a massive amount of change. It seems simple on paper. There's a lot of change involved that gets down to a lot of individual bits of granularity about regulation, there's load and balance, and so I think there's something about almost kind of a micro and a macro change management process, and they all need the kind of the same sort of diligence around them. But I think we probably don't do the kind of the macro big thinking on these things, because they're were forced upon us, and might well be in the future as well. I think the other thing is, as part of that is understanding, the wider impacts and the bits that Steve and Catherine just talked about the human factors, the human performance impact on these things, and also the understanding the resilience or the ability of the system to be able to cope with large amount of changes. There's a lot of people involved, and whilst they will have their own individual resilience issues to cope with, there's also a systemic resilience, of how much the industry can cope with these changes. And I think there's some really big learnings we can take away from how we do those bigger changes from a change management point of view, as well as doing all the smaller ones. So I think, and I think overall it's not been perfect. Things have happened. I think we haven't done badly. I think we've learned an awful lot over the last 18 months about these things as well. I think that the danger is that we don't capture all the lessons as well. So over to Catherine.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. I think that's led very neatly. And again, in the position that I have been over the last 18 months, I've worked quite extensively with ICAO, looking at variations to start off with, looking at the flight time limitations and getting into that space, and then moving on to supporting them with the development of the roadmap to ops normal and looking at that constant level of change. And today's environment is different from the people that were experiencing it, same people, but 6 months ago or 12 months ago. And I think being very aware of that role of change, and it's different as it goes on, because last year we did X, therefore we can do that again today, is not the same. And being very fortunate to have been in the position to support the development of the ICAO's Human Performance Manual for regulators, where we developed 5 principles about human performance for anybody, for all of us in actual fact. And I think if we use those 5 questions basically around understanding how people work, then we'd be in a better place when we look at that level of change. Just some really quite fundamental questions. And then we can think about, okay, how would the system is going to influence how people behave? So that contextual piece. So I think with that change, it's really important that we don't compartmentalize it into an individual item, but we actually take that systems approach, that systems thinking approach. And I think that's created a real opportunity to take what is actually a global move into trying to better understand how people fit in safety critical industries. And again, I've been working with quite a few other regulatory industries, from nuclear to road, rail as well, and looking at how we apply that systems thinking assessment process. So the safety 2 part, I think Steve was highlighting there, how we learn from what people do well to cope with those situations. I think if we can get more information and get people used to giving us that bit, to listen more within our data, not just to look at our data. So that's very much that stamp cast methodology of looking at, from a systems thinking perspective, about how people perform. So that holistic rather than probabilistic approach. So I think if we start moving in that direction, and there's a lot to learn, and we've highlighted this in part 1 of our regulators manual, just to get people on that movement, to start that conversation. And I think that's one of the lessons and opportunities that's come out of the pandemic, is to progress that picture, rather than keep doing just because the ICAO safety management manual says we do a bow tie or a matrix. I think when we think about people, I think this is one of the opportunities that has come out, because we need to be more flexible, adaptable, and context driven. So I think when we're looking at change, we need to be more flexible about that and to be much more driven. So again, moving away from that classification as individual error and think about more as the changes every stage of the system. And it's more of an ecosystem. This is a complex system. We have complicated parts, but this is actually operating in a really complex socio-technical area that has multiple influences. So I think I don't have the answers to this yet, but I definitely think from a change management perspective, this has given us the opportunity to explore more of that and how we as an aviation regulator can take some parts of it. And this is not about throwing out the baby with the bathwater. This is absolutely understanding the good bits that we do now, the really robust measures, really learning from our organizations. And then as a regulator, taking a bit more of that overarching view and trying to join the gaps rather than fall down them. So that's what I think this opportunity for change and how we look at change will actually strengthen us coming out of the pandemic.
I'd like to build on that, if I can, this sort of ecosystem part of change management. Change management is rarely done best if it's imposed on people. Inclusivity is an important part of it, and bringing along the workforce within the change management, rather than it being something which is cooked up at the higher levels and then, as say, imposed on people below to adopt. The workforce wants the company to succeed and survive. Their jobs depend on it, and they have some really good ideas. But if we're not listening to them, then you're going to end up with them feeling, well, at best not valued, but at worst resisting the change. So I think that as we do build back again, there's a real opportunity here to include workforces in that whole systemic approach and ask them how they think they can, we can contribute or improve matter. And build back better is a great expression, isn't it? But we can, I think, build this back better, differently, but better. But we're only going to do that if we bring everybody into the tent and work with them. So I think that's how I would build on from what Catherine just said, really, in my view of the change management.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks, Catherine and Glenn as well. So very clear that effective change management can only really happen if you bring your workforce with you. Really like the idea of actually asking them, what do you think? What would make effective change for you? Links into what Catherine was saying earlier about better understanding of how things are done at the sharp end as well. So the work is done aspects as opposed to how it's managed or how it's prescribed at a very high level procedural level. I think the importance of the flexibility to take a more holistic rather than probabilistic approach. Again, Catherine, you mentioned that, very interesting. If I could ask just very quickly, so obviously ICAO produced Doc 101-51, aimed more at the regulator, but some great principles in there, and it's fantastic to hear that the CAA embodying that. Do you have any thoughts about how the sort of principles in that could be rolled out to industry, or how industry could be brought along to buy into that in terms of how they run their own safety management systems?
Thanks, Joji. When we were developing the manual, we started this in 2017, so well before the pandemic. So when we were developing the manual, we got industry, so Eurocontrol, we had Emirates, we had industry stakeholders throughout that, and then that ended up with just myself, CAA, FAA, and EASA finalising the manual. But what the benefit of having all the industry there was, we identified roles and actually put a series of questions. What's the role? What's the environment? What are the particular human performance challenges? And how can we best support people with those challenges? And I think there's and we did a lot of work around that, which isn't actually in the manual. And I'm meeting next week to look at very much more that implementation, to give some scenarios. And those sort of template questions using the principles and those about people in their operational context, I think is something that we could look to roll out, to offer. And again, a template's good, but it's not the answer. It has to be applied. You have to take it into your operational context. Airlines fly airplanes, but they're not all the same. ATM environments provide traffic, but it's not all the same. We had a recent conversation with the military about their level of traffic. And actually I said, but have you thought about how your military operations operating through civil airspace are now going to be impacted by potentially more civil airspace, civil aviation going on? And they hadn't really thought about it from the other side. So again, it is about supporting people to see it from the other side, to see the other parts of the system. And hopefully maybe we can implement those templates more as form of Q&A on our website with the ARSA, with the FAA, to help organizations then structure that conversation internally to actually identify what they need to be doing, rather than just put something in a hazard log. It's actually saying, who are our people? Where do they operate? What are their challenges? How can we support them? So I think that framework will hopefully be something that we can offer out.
And thanks, Catherine. It's an ongoing conversation, isn't it? Very interesting. Glenn, was there anything else you wanted to add from your perspective to that?
No, I think Catherine's covered it really well there, obviously being heavily involved with it. I mean, there's a lot that we can and still need to do, as the industry evolves, not only through, post-pandemic, but also, into a new environment that we're going into. So obviously with the Glasgow COP26 starting today, there's going to be changes that are going to come around to the industry that won't be quite as, hopefully won't stark or as quick as a pandemic, but they will have, lasting changes where the industry needs to evolve, and how we adapt to those changes and learn from the past and do those as best we can will be very important. So.
And thank you. So we got a lot of the issues that we'll draw out in some more specific questions shortly, but we've touched on them already, I think, in many of the answers. Before we do that, we've got 3 questions from the audience. I believe one from Tom, Luis, and an anonymous question here, actually. So if I can go to Stu, please, to take those questions from the floor. So Tom Harrison's question first, please, Stu.
Sure. Well, I was looking at Tom. Thanks, Tom and Luis. Those 2 questions, perhaps we can wrap them up as a single item it appears to me. So Tom's question was that, is there a hindsight or lesson learning point from the last 18 months that could be used should a future crisis occur? And Luis digs into the level of collaboration between stakeholders in aviation and ATM is seen as one of the main positives. What has been, in your opinion, the biggest limitation or shortcoming of the industry highlighted by the pandemic, and how can it be addressed? So I guess I wonder, perhaps if each of you, is there one big standout learning point that we're going to write into the book for future pandemic or crisis handling? What's the big thing where, and this is no detriment to the people because you've been handling all this stuff live, you've seen it unfold, often in unexpected ways. So, but maybe what's the big thing that next time around we will do this instead of that?
That's a very good question, a very difficult one to answer. I think there's having talked about the industry relying on a degree of certainty and predictability, there's also a danger of fighting yesterday's battles the whole time, and the next pandemic or crisis that comes along won't look like this one. It possibly will, but it's unlikely to look like this one. And next crisis is undoubtedly on about something different. So I think we need to look at a very high level about what the good things that came out of it were, and how we build on those, and rather than actually say here's a playbook for pandemics for the future, because that isn't really going to work. And it was there from the past anyway, with SARS and MERS and things like that, which was of limited value. It did help, certainly on the biosecurity side and the medical side in the initial stages. So I think there's there's something about learning from a crisis, about how to be flexible and agile and during a crisis process, rather than just saying this is crisis number 17, we'll wheel out this solution and then wonder why it doesn't work, because it breaks down that thinking. And I think it's understanding what we do well, and going to one of Catherine's points, that actually what we do well in these sorts of situations is how people respond and how they react to it. And I think there's something around kind of nurturing that. So we have this thing certainly inside the authority with that in the CAA, where day to day we don't necessarily do things great. So as a crisis comes along, and the way the business reacts is completely different, and we handle it much better. And we're spending all the time looking at ourselves, given it, how do we do so well in a crisis, react well in a crisis, but don't take that stuff into business as usual, day-to-day stuff. So we're aware of it. I'm not sure there's a solution there, but I think there's something about taking those nuggets out of what goes well in a crisis and making sure that we use those rather than just kind of relying on it. Hopefully it all come together on the day kind of thing, and say, well, what does work well? What do we need to be doing with that day to day? Some of it is about a heightened level of arousal because it's a crisis and different things are going on, and some of it is about just capturing what people do well, what gets them into a good space and to that higher level of performance. Catherine, do you want to take it from there, since I've strayed into your area?
No, you haven't strayed. We all collaborate, Glenn. But yeah, so taking that on, and I think from my perspective, we've seen throughout the pandemic the use of technology. So that has enabled us to stay connected. It has enabled us to keep active. It's enabled us within the CAA to keep connected with our industry. And I think there has been also the innovation challenges. So delivering medical supplies using UAS. So we've had drone use, that increase. We've had those sort of like the thinkers, because we haven't been able to do it the traditional way. So I think from a lessons learned positive, there's an awful lot there that we can sort of take into what we're doing, to consider, to think about that technology. And how we can best use it to support, and I would always say to support people to do a good job, to support them to be their best. And some of those lessons learned about, we learned lessons, we have an MEL because we don't let the pilots and the engineers decide on the day whether they're going to go with certain pieces of equipment. So one of the lessons learned is there something that we could do so that we actually support people? Because we say, yeah, you're not going with this because of this other aspect. So are there some of those things that we could put in there to support people to make the decisions on the day? So I think from lessons learned, there's a lot around there using the technology, and then thinking what we can do to help people more on the day from what's worked well. But I think the question about what hasn't worked so well is we have government limitations. And I think with any of these sorts of things, it's that the society, those social pressures, and that frequent change there. Just when we think, because we need to think so much about the safety of the system and supporting everyone to do what we need, when the government's change things so quickly, I think there's a lesson that has been a real challenge for us, is that they change it so quickly, and you can be en route somewhere, and the state you're going to will have changed what it is you're going to do. So I think that's one of those, the hardest things, but the collaboration between and across the industry, I think has been really one of the biggest things, the biggest benefits. And I think that's something we should always continue to focus on, very much more so.
I think for me, Joji, I mean, there are so many lessons out there to bring out this whole thing. And I'm just trying to, in my own mind, prioritize them on the fly here. I think the first one is recognizing that things have changed. It sounds a little bit odd. And I actually would highlight here, the good example was Glenn's flight ops team, changed the regulatory posture because they needed to, get more close to, the companies to, deal with day-to-day issues. So it's that recognition and not trying to persist with the old systems and processes, because that's what we've always done, and recognizing that things need to change. So that's sort of a background issue for me, and I think that's something which we can learn about. When do we I say recognize this is a long-term process, 2 years worth before we recover or whatever and more, rather than it'll be over in a couple of months. And I think that's initially there was a bit of this will be over in a couple of months. So we'll just carry on, shall we? And we'll just put a few people on furlough or whatever, and we'll just get them back again in the summer. That's an important key matter. When did things change? The follow on from that is the flexibility to be able to enact change, and that's not just flexibility of the company. It's that systemic thing. The workforce also has to understand things have to change, and we're not going to be in the situation we were in 2 years ago. So as workforce and management need to understand that there needs to be flexibility in how we approach things. And then the last part of that, I think, is important for management not to detach the workforce. And I got a strong impression from the reporting I got that there was, okay, this thing's happened, okay, off you go, you lot, half of you, you're on furlough. We'll talk to you, in a few months' time. Don't bother us, we're busy trying to maintain the company. You mustn't do that. You've got to keep them engaged. Things that I've seen, people have lost the habit of reporting or engaging in safety systems. I've got contemporaries and friends who are on furlough. They haven't read any of the company notices for the last 6 months. Why would they? They're not going to fly for, who knows when. And then suddenly, bang, you're going to be on a conversion now to this new aircraft type. We want you to do it in 2 weeks' time. Oh, I can't do that. I haven't thought about flying. So the workforce has become somewhat detached from the system. And I think that's a lesson which we need to learn. That there needs to be close engagement, communicate. It's very easy to blame communication, isn't it? But there needs to be close engagement with the workforce, and not dare I say, a separation, us versus them, or whatever, however you want to look at it, between those dealing with the problem and those who are working within the problem.
Thank you, guys. Really interesting. So we're starting to get questions coming through from the audience now, which is great. What I'd like to do is sort of maybe roll back a little bit. So at the beginning of the session, we talked about maybe 3 categories of questioning, consequences of the pandemic, how things are recovering, and then looking to the future for opportunities and maybe risks. So if we can go back to some of the things that we observed through the pandemic, very different operational environment, very different practices. I'd like to just pick a couple of questions again from the audience that link into that. So we've got a question here about COVID has resulted in increased use of online training or simulated training. The questionee says, saves money for NSPs and airlines, and they may well want to do more of it in the future as we emerge from the pandemic. So the question is, how does the CA ensure that the right balance is struck between the sim online type of training, whether that's for new trainees or experienced people, and other types of training, whether that's pilots or controllers?
It's a very good question, and it's a kind of a new era that we're kind of moving into that's probably been accelerated by the pandemic. I think there's a lot of things that that need to be done from a regulatory point of view that that we will have to change the regulations on for it to be able to happen. But there's a lot of things out there that can be done using clever technology, and I've looked at some AR and some VR stuff about teaching you how to start up a helicopter, for example. I'm not a helicopter pilot, and all of a sudden, within about 2 or 3 minutes, using these clever technologies, you think you can do these things. So it's a really, really powerful way of doing things. I think the important thing is using the right medium for training for the right reasons to the right end. if it's just done as a cost saving, look, fantastic, we can do everything online and it's virtual, isn't that great? It saves lots of money, saves people coming into a training center and do these things. So that's kind of the wrong reason. If it's actually it's far more effective doing it like this for these parts of the training. Other parts, we can then make better use of face-to-face training for those things that need it. And we're looking at some technologies that are, are very much around that. They give you some bite-sized learning, and it's AI type stuff where you ask your questions so it understands how much you know and then takes you down a path accordingly. So I think if we were to sit here and say, no, we're going to draw a line in the sand and say this is exactly how it's going to stay and it's going to stay like this forever, I think we're really losing an opportunity. The teaching techniques that we use in the aviation industry are somewhat dated at the moment, and we need to explore what technology can help with how the teaching and training environment can be better, not just as this is a cost-saving exercise to do that. So we are mindful that we have some work to do in that space, and I think for us it's a case of demonstrate that it's compliant and as if not more effective, and that would drive our decision making. Excellent.
It's great to hear this context specific type approaches, whether it's training or oversight, or that's great to hear. Catherine, Steve, is there anything you want to add to that?
I'll just add from my perspective, coming from the military world. The military world are going into a lot of this simulated versus live thing, 50-50 split in some areas and more. And it all depends on the fidelity of simulation, doesn't it? That's what it's down to. I mean, some great simulators out there now that can replicate a lot of what we do, but it's the background context they're operating in. It's the grit in the system. It's when you're actually doing something and the little niggles and whatever things you have to think on your feet. So simulator stuff is very good at procedural training, what is supposed to happen. But we just need to be careful that we don't lose sight of the need to do what humans do best, which is thinking around problems, which may well be unexpected. So, and I know that Glenn's aware of this. It's the currency versus recency thing. You can be recent in that you've done your sim flying within your whatever period it might well be. That doesn't mean to say that you are, you are competent, but you're not operating at your best level. You're not current with what you're doing. So there's a trap we can fall into in doing a sim let's do a sim every 2 months, shall we, whatever. And that'll be enough. As opposed to actually a recency thing of actually getting in an aircraft, flying it or operating it, or down the back end of an aircraft or in a control tower, maneuvering aircraft around a radar screen. So that, to me, that's a perspective we need to be very careful of.
Can I just build on that before we come to Catherine? Because there's one of the things we've been looking at over the last 18 months and talking to the industry a lot about, and you talked about recency, there's regulatory requirements and all those sort of things. If you put people in the simulators, they do 3 takeoffs and landings, say, good, you're recent again for the next 90 days, that's fantastic. That's completely missed the point. So there's 2 aspects to this. One is training for competency, and there's a lot of people who have sat around for a long time. And I suspect that given a simulation, a decent instructor, within an hour or 2, they'll be perfectly competent at flying all the regulatory requirements that they need to do to have their license signed or whatever it is. So that one thing is about competency. What that doesn't train is any sort of resilience. It doesn't take into account the trainees' needs and what they're requiring. So all the stuff that Steve talked about earlier with people going to work, everybody's got lives, everybody's got baggage that they're carrying with them, whatever it happens to be, and it affects more people and they manage it differently to others. They're taking that to work. So they're going into a training environment. What is that individual's actual need? If you just say it's a regulator, I've got to tick these boxes and they're fine, and I'll put them out into a live environment that's now completely different from what they've seen a year ago. Even, the process of getting to the aircraft are different, the processes on board different, everything's different. And they're working in an environment where the air traffickers aren't as current, the ground handlers aren't as current. Everything's different. Everything is the stress is from a human perspective all the way through. So, you know, we've been focusing on this with it and say, you know, yes, you need to train for competence, but on top of that, you need to train for resilience. And that might be individuals' needs about how they cope with unexpected situations. And as Steve just pointed out very quickly, it's about making people think and putting them in those challenging and stressful situations so they can develop that resilience. It's not about what they're actually doing. It's about the thinking and the processing and the human in there. And hence, that makes a very lovely segue into Catherine.
I mean, you've both described it very well. It's outcome. What is the outcome of the training? And I think that's the challenge of the question. So is it to pass information that it can be supported and found elsewhere? Or is it to support development, learning, change of a behavior? And VR may be able to help us with quite a lot of that as well. But when you are trying to teach human interaction, you need to have some level, whether it's in the simulator or in a classroom, to have those discussions. And it's the normal part of life as well. You need to understand the normal part of life. So you may go into the simulator, you may do all the emergencies as a controller as well. You may do all those emergencies, but it's that normal part of life when things get a little bit busy, or actually, did we put the beacon on? And it's those sorts of things. I could cope with an engine failure on takeoff, but I actually haven't put the beacon on to let the ground handlers know that we're actually going to start moving in a minute. So it's putting all of that together to actually say, what is the outcome of this training we're trying to deliver? And it's not for us as the regulator, it's for you as the operator. It's actually supporting your people to do the best they can do, to do well on the day, to support the safety of the operation. And that should always be the outcome. There's a very nice little analogy that I know is used in air traffic. I'll show you a presentation of how to knit PowerPoint. I can show you how to do it. And then if you think that I can actually take a ball of wool and 2 knitting needles and knit you a nice cable knit jumper, having shown me just a PowerPoint presentation, that's not going to happen. So it has to be about the outcome and the most appropriate medium, but taking opportunities to look at the technology that we have now.
Yeah. I'll come to Stu actually, because until recently Stu was a recipient of this sort of stuff. I think you've got some points you'd like to make, Stu.
Yeah, thanks, Joji. Yeah, it's interesting to listen and to get the opportunity to talk about these things. When the pandemic first started so we would be having a meeting back in March 2020, and I was there with Joji and a number of other esteemed colleagues sat around the table, and we were saying, you know, what's the big risk here? And we sort of, it's pretty obvious that in the rundown, we didn't know what was going to happen then, the risk doesn't occur. The threat as you run down is not huge, but there's a massive potential safety threat as you ramp up operations. And of course, at that time, we didn't know how long this was going to go on. It was maybe 3 months, 6 months, whatever it was. And so we were, you know, very aware, because we'd seen incidents like previous SARS or like 9/11 or like the unpronounceable volcano event, where a large part of the industry didn't operate for a while. But what occurred to us at the time, and discussing this over many years, that the recency training and check-in requirements have been set up for a kind of normal ops time. So, I mean, I don't fly anymore. I stopped flying a while ago, but finished on the A380. So we were doing a lot of heavy crew work. And if you had an extended amount of time off, perhaps somebody had an operation, a medical operation, or an extended holiday or whatever it was, they came back and you could be pretty sure that the recency levels within that crew and the general recency levels across the fleet were high. So those regulatory minimums were sufficient and time proven to deliver crews that would operate in a safe way. But you've got something now that we've never seen before, and that is entire fleets of pilots that have hardly operated in an 18-month period. And you're going to be bringing together crews which are completely unpracticed. And every single member of that crew might have hardly operated for that time. So you can't fall back on the fact that I've just had, you know, 8 weeks off, 2 months off because I had a hospital operation, but my 2 colleagues in the flight deck were both flying yesterday. There isn't that to support your particular day-to-day operation, little nudges and reminders and all of those great human factors things that we do so well. And that's where I think the big worry is for me. And so what I wanted to ask you about is that in times like this, isn't there a need for a more increased level of mandatory training and actually, more importantly, practice opportunity? So non-jeopardy exposure to being able to do the job. So I'm putting it to you in a way to say that whatever the recency training requirements were pre-pandemic, that as we have been during and coming out of this pandemic, should we not be looking to increase the exposure of crews, operators in particular, thinking about increasing their exposure to simulator and other aspects of training to significantly above the mandatory minimum levels of training that we would normally think of as being the usual way of flying and operating.
Absolutely, so some really good points. The danger, you're exactly right in what you're saying, that the devil is in the detail, and the danger is in what we do. So you talk about there increasing mandatory requirements. We could do that. We can increase mandatory requirements. You could do more single engine INSs. You could do more, single engine go rounds. It doesn't really address the issue. This is very much down to the safety management is managing operators' risks. It's the operators, they need to identify what risks they have in their operation and come up with mitigations to do that. And they're all different, of course. So if you mandate something, it might be appropriate for a 380 fleet that's been grounded for 18 months, but it might be inappropriate for a 320 fleet that's been running all the way through and different mix in there. So the solution to this is not a regulatory lever. It's the interaction we have with operators about how they manage their safety management systems, the risks that they identify, and what they put in place around that. And there's a lot of discussion with all the major airlines about recency and currency and what extra layers they put on and how they mix recent and less recent crews and to do that, and what they can put in place, what additional simulators they can put in or provide to provide some context, jump seat familiarization for people that have been away from the environment for a while, even videoing flights so people can actually just sit there and watch virtually to see how things might have changed. So you're entirely right. I just think that the issue is that for the regulator's perspective, the mandatory requirement is probably not the right lever, and where we come into it is to work with the operators to make sure that they've identified all the relevant risks and are addressing it through their safety management system, which should determine what training, what recency and currency requirements do they have for their operation.
I think I'll jump in as well here and just say we need to be careful not to over-reg this whole recency versus currency thing to a certain extent. I'm not diminishing there is an issue here, but I come from a perspective of a single seat cockpit. The very thing you're talking about, you come back off after 2 months off and you're on your own. So how do we cope with that? Well, that's why we have procedures. And so it's understanding the procedures, flying by the procedures, taking things steadily, and for actually companies to give space for crews to take things steadily, rather, as I mentioned in my piece at the introduction, I want you off the chocks away from the departure gate at X minus 5 minutes or whatever. No, take your time, treat it carefully. So I sound like I'm arguing against recency versus currency here. I'm not. I'm just saying that's why we have procedures. We have procedures in there for people to understand threat and error management. Hey, everybody in this airplane is pretty unpracticed. Okay, let's take it steadily. Let's do it by the book. So that's another issue we don't want to lose sight of as well.
Absolutely. And just to build on that, and on top of that, it's understanding that everybody's in that situation, vocalizing it, saying, because we don't necessarily do that as well as possible. There's a lot of kind of assumption, cross flight deck assumption about, I'm sure he understands what's going on, and vice versa, what's not happening. But also, the procedures are the kind of the foundation that keep you there. But you've got the contextual risks, the distraction, everything looking different. And it's like, you just need to keep coming back to, right, we've been manage those distractions. And I'm not very good at managing distractions because I've not done it for a long time. and the person that's distracting me isn't very good at doing it either. The dispatcher is, you know, is not very current and things. So it's like you just need to kind of go back to basics and say everything, all these little things that you would cope with on a day-to-day basis now become much bigger risk factors, and people need to understand that, you know, how they're performing individually, how much capacity they've got left or not, how much capacity the crew members have got left, and how to deal with that. So that we talked about that a lot over the whole kind of build up, and it's that contextual risk of understanding that, you know, that the foundation of the basic SOPs that will keep you in the right place, but you've got to kind of stick to them. And we do see them when people step outside of them without good reason, or by accident because of, you know, distraction or something else has happened. Then that's where it creates a degree of confusion, and that confusion, of course, can then escalate. You know, if you lose situational awareness, and we've seen some events around this where it can go wrong quite quickly, where both people have lost situation, or one person's lost situation to a greater extent than the other, and they've not understood how much the other person is out of the loop and not necessarily supported each other in as well as they possibly could. So it goes back to that training for resilience and what that actually means. So getting people back to the right place. Sorry, Kathleen.
No, I would only add to that. It's about thinking about it. So the organisation's demonstrating how they bring people back into the system, recognizing that challenge, recognizing the operational context as they're bringing people back in, looking at other areas. So like in the US, you know, they got back to domestic much faster than we did. So what have been the key things? What have been the things that you wouldn't think would happen that you could maybe communicate across? And I think there is also, though, speaking to Steve's element, and what I said earlier, for individuals, if you haven't flown since the start of the pandemic, that is really quite significant. So how do you keep connected with those people who work for you? How do you bring them back in so that they can feel confident? Do you have some peer-to-peer, some support structures outside of that can help support that? And do you have a way in which you can maybe do some online flight threat management prep, almost the normal flight, you know, activities that you can actually support people to come and get involved in before they go back in the sim, before they go back out onto the line. So I think there are some of those activities, but it is very much our driver is to get the organization to say, this is our context, these are our people, this is their experience level, this is how we're going to bring them back in to our performance, not just to say to the CAA, what do you want me to do? So I think it's that working together part, so that challenge and response, and to see that demonstration of context. And
just to add on, to build on that if I can as well. And one of the things we talked about before is learning the lessons of 2021 to take them into 2022. So we've done a kind of 30% to 60% build up in 2021. So we're now going to operators and saying, well, what lessons have you learned? How would you do it differently and better? Because you've got the rest to do now. And that's the harder bit, because they're potentially the people who've been out the loop longer. And so, you know, how do you do it better, you know, for 2022? And they're all engaged with that. And that, you know, comes down to Stuart's point about bringing back a whole fleet, you know, which is a fairly unique kind of situation, both from an engineering point of view and from a crew point of view and cabin crew point of view. So there's a whole raft of things there. So in some respects, it almost makes the thing easier, because, you know, everybody's starting from a bad place. There's no kind of assumption, well, there's a few people still current and we'll mix them up and do that. No, everybody's in the worst place. So yeah, they have to take a bit more extreme and more cautious things. But, you know, it's a matter of, you know, as I say, working with industry to understand all the good points and the bad points over 2021 and making sure they're embedded for the ramp up for 2022.
Thank you, Glenn. It's an interesting discussion, actually, and I think a lot of what you've been saying answers a lot of the questions we were going to ask, actually. So that's fortuitous, as well as being an interesting discussion. I'm kind of mindful of the time. The session really has sort of flown by. So really, before we finish, I'm quite keen to just capture the last few questions from the floor. There's three. Two of them are fairly similar. Again, it's kind of relating to things that we've seen through the pandemic, one being use of slightly different FTL variations for ultra long haul flights, and something similar, in the ATM world. And the question, so this is from Graham. So where these extended FTLs have been used, do you see similar things happening in the future? And what would be your view on that?
Absolutely. So extended FTLs is an interesting one because there's two parts to this answer. As I said all the way through, we need to learn from what has happened over the last 18 months and take all the good points out. Actually, the extended FTLs have been a useful lifeline where required, basically to get people on those long haul destinations out of there again without being subject to the various restrictions in there. So initially with the exemptions, we said there was some general exemptions we put out, and we changed that from March this year to we'll very much avoid general exemptions, and there'll be exemption operator exemptions only. So there's only a couple of operators that have got extended FTLs. They serve a purpose. They are not a long-term solution. Operators will whilst they have them up their sleeves, they don't like use them because it's very crew hungry. It's not great from a crew perspective either. So they will try to avoid using them as much as possible. But what it does do, it gives them a way of dealing with the situation where a state closes down the countries or gives them limitations and restrictions on what they can do, so they can keep a viable operation going. So I don't see those happening. There will be other things. We'll look at everything that we've done exemption wise, but in theory, most of them will just go, or we might, there might be some tweaks around the edges, but certainly extended FTLs, it's that one they'll go as soon as the operators no longer need to have that tool in their toolbox.
I think my concern with FTL is that, and we want to be careful. The whole FTL thing is a bit of a dark science, and which I'm not quite sure that it's applicable across everybody. I mean, we've all got our own different ability to cope with fatigue, but we come from a position where they were there for a reason. We mustn't forget that. A long, hard experience of why FTL is there in the first place. And my concern is that a couple of years ago, we were seeing more and more companies operating to the FTL limit because they can. They were never really intended that way. FTL limits were intended as a sort of approach them with care perspective. So I'm concerned that as we ramp up, we will see more companies operating to the limits because they can legally do that, whereas it's not a position we might want to be in, because we can end up with fatiguing people even though they are satisfying the FTL limits, and it should only be done with care and with fewer crews, fewer controllers, whatever. You could end up with people actually working very hard, long hours, and then starting to make mistakes. So I'm more concerned about the limits themselves than the extended FTL piece as well.
Very good. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Glenn. Just mindful of the time, we've just hit 11:31 now. There was one outstanding question. I don't think we're going to have time to ask that today, but it's one we can certainly hold over for possible future opportunity. It feels like we could go on for a lot longer, but unfortunately, we do have to draw to a close. So I feel that we've had a really productive discussion. It's been very interesting. So thank you, Glenn, Catherine, and Steve, for your interesting and thoughtful insights. We really do appreciate how open and candid you've been in your answers. In terms of myself, takeaway points, I'd probably summarise with just some words, just for the audience to sort of think about as they go away. Resilience, context, adaptability, agility, engagement, collaboration, all seem to wrap up the issues we've been discussing this morning. So certainly, when I go away, thinking about myself, not just my work with BALPA, I'll be thinking about those words as well. So thank you again to our panelists. Thank you also to you, the audience, for your attendance, your questions as you've asked them as we've gone through. I hope you found the discussion as insightful from your end as it was from mine. Stu mentioned it at the beginning very quickly. Phil Tanner. I know Phil was not able to join us for the beginning of the session. He was actually busy controlling aircraft. I think he may have joined us towards the end of the session. So again, just to re-emphasize, massive thank you for all your hard work in putting this session and the 3 sessions to come together for the future. So the video recording for this one will be made available, so keep an eye out for that in the coming days, both on GATCO and BALPA websites. Before I go, just wanted to mention the next session. So Monday, the 8th of November, again, 10 AM UK time, we'll be covering automation and artificial intelligence in aviation, both in the context of the flight deck and the control center. So very, very current, very topical, should be a fascinating discussion. One very last thing for me before I hand over to Stu to close. When we end this webinar, you'll be presented with a link for a very brief survey. It's just 4 questions to answer. If you have time, I'd be grateful for you to spare a minute or two just to answer those questions and give us some feedback on this session. So once again, thanks again to you all. Take care, stay safe, and hopefully see you again at the next session. So I'll hand over to Stu.
Well, thanks very much, everyone. And thanks in particular to Glenn, Catherine and Steve and Joji for hosting a really interesting webinar. As Joji said, it will be out on the internet. So I know a lot of people couldn't attend today for reasons of work, and that's a good thing, isn't it? So please let your colleagues know about it. We'll be disseminating the information so people can benefit from this excellent discussion. And all it remains to say is thanks for all of your participation, your questions, your interest. Next event, as Joji says, next Monday, 10 o'clock, automation and AI in aviation. So from all of us here today and from the broader community of air traffic controllers and pilots, thanks very much. We'll see you soon.